Okay, welcome, welcome, welcome. Good to see you folks. Welcome to Free Together, Free Apart, Hacking Family Success, formerly known as the more depressing Stuck Together, Stuck Apart. We decided to upgrade to a less depressing message here in 2020. It's been a special year. And I want to thank you all for joining us today for what I think is going to be a really just a special conversation with somebody who's been incredibly meaningful to this organization, the Vermont Center for Family Studies. Dr. Papero started visiting Vermont. He's a bit of an itinerant preacher going around the country and then eventually the world, delivering very high quality information to us starting in the 90s here in Vermont. He'd come twice a year. I'm sure I've heard at least 200 hours of Dan's wisdom, and very influential to me personally and professionally, as well as many of us here in Vermont. Dr. Papero, as most of you know, is one of the leaders in the family systems world, certainly in the Bowen theory, which is a leader in the family systems world, and a faculty member of the Bowen Center for the Study of Families in DC, longtime faculty member. And we're very, very pleased to have you here with us today, Dan.
Hi, Eric.
Got a few old friends on the call here, Dan.
Have we?
Yes. Nord Brew let me know he can't make it because he has a tire problem. But some of you may know that Nord Brew and his wife, Suzanne, have been very strong members of our Vermont Center for Family Studies community. And for years, Nord, who founded Brugger's Bagel Company, had him coming in and working with their organization here in Burlington. So another feature of Dan's influence on Vermont. Well, Dan, what should we chat about?
I don't know, Eric, what's on your mind?
Oh, that's a great question. When I thought about interviewing you, Dan, I like this title, A Life in Theory. I thought this might be a special opportunity. It's near the end of the year to allow you to do some reflecting for us on lessons learned with living with the theory for so long. For example, I was going to ask you, which were the rookie mistakes that bother you the most when you look back to the early days that maybe some of us on the call are right in the middle of?
No, it's a good question. Let me get the book of mistakes out because it's a very big one. Gosh, I don't know, Eric. When I met Murray Bowen, I was young, relatively speaking, anyway. Mm-hmm. And I was enthusiastic, and it was right on the cusp of the explosion of the interest in the family, which happened in the late 60s and early 70s. And it was the hottest thing in the world right then, at least in the world of mental health therapy, that sort of thing. And it made intuitive sense to me. But in hindsight, probably the biggest rookie error I made was not taking full advantage of Murray Bowen's brain by pushing him hard about his thinking. I guess it's understandable that I didn't. Here he was, the esteemed leader of the field, and I'm a rookie coming in. And in those days, I had bell-bottom trousers and an afro, and he and I didn't run in the same circles. So I don't think I pushed enough. In some ways, I learned a lot from him, but I think I could have learned more had I been willing to push at him a bit more. And he didn't tolerate too much pushing. I'll have that to say too. But I wish I'd done more of that.
If you were going to push, you could expect to be facing a tiger at times.
Yeah, if you pushed, you better have your ducks in a row. Let's frame it that way. If you didn't have your ducks in a row, you'd be quickly sorted out and sent back to get them in a row before you came back to work at it.
That's a very interesting answer. That
there are all kinds of therapy mistakes that people make, and they're just endless. And that's not so important. Therapy mistakes in some ways often aren't terribly consequential. So you get another shot at it. Um,
Mhm.
I suppose the biggest therapy mistake is sort of thinking that if I could just teach people Bowen theory, they'd know what to do with it. And of course, that works about as well as spitting against the wind. It doesn't go very far. And
But you learned, and it's good. Well, let's pivot back and forth between theory and practice. So you learn not to teach as much
I
over the
certainly learned not to teach as much. I had come into the world that I was in that point out of university teaching, and I was not very good at university teaching. It may have been the field I was in. I don't know. I came out of it thinking I have never been able to teach anybody anything. But that didn't stop me from going in and trying to teach people Bowen theory with about the same results I had in academia, I think.
So if you're not trying to teach them, then what comes in once you get over that, then what's your focus? What'd you learn to do more of?
I learned to stop talking as much for one thing, although that's a lesson I have to keep relearning.
Hmm.
Our colleague, Selden Illick, tells a story of Bowen that when she first heard him, she said something to him like, and I don't have the words exactly right, Dr. Bowen, if I did what you said, I wouldn't say anything in a session. He apparently looked at her and smiled and said, that'd be a good start. And that was kind of it, Bowen's brilliance lay in his observational abilities in many ways. And one of the things that I think is most overlooked, not so much nowadays, it gets talked about more nowadays than it did in the beginning, was his emphasis of the clinician staying in the position of a researcher. In other words, not trying to grab on the bean and make it grow by pulling on it, but to be interested in how the bean perceives its own conditions and what the bean thinks is required for it to grow, something like that. And that's still a hard thing to do for the mental health person. And my sense is that this is true for the business consultant as well. They want to go in with an answer for someone. And I think those answers are few and far between, frankly. I think there are occasionally answers that can be given, perhaps more in the form of structures for thinking or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the pressure to have an answer for the clinician and for the consultant is just enormous.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it takes, I don't know what it takes to sit in that world and really stay focused on what one learns about the role of helping if one works with the Bowen theory. Helping, whether it's in the clinical world or in the consulting world.
You asked what it takes, and I submit it might take quite a bit of clarity and some good mentoring. And I do think that both in the clinical arena and the one you're talking about now, most clients really appreciate being listened to and respect for the fact that they're the ones who are going to make the decisions. And they appreciate a really observant present. You mentioned Bowen's gift for observing. Maybe that was part of what he was giving to his clients. I'm going to sit with you and observe.
He had an ability, perhaps better than anyone I've ever known, and it's one I've tried to develop myself, to understand how people saw their world and what they saw themselves as up against, what they were dealing with, to appreciate the position that the person was in. Mm-hmm. And neither to be dismissive of that, nor to feel sorry for that individual, but to make contact with that individual in that position. And Bowen was in my view, Bowen was a bit of a genius at that. And I learned a lot from him about how you work at, nowadays, it's called theory of mind in a certain sense, to put yourself in the other one's position and see the world from the way that one sees it. Doesn't mean you agree with that viewpoint. Doesn't mean you oppose it. It just means you can see it, which opens up I suppose, the negotiation room between the helper and the person sitting on the other side. the
Would you
negotiation room for what do we have in common that will spur both of us to work on this problem.
Dan, would you call that empathy?
Oh, I don't know. I don't.
Overused term.
It's an
Would you
overused
dare
term.
to call Bowen a genius of empathy?
Yeah, it's an overused term. I tend to avoid that term myself. It's not that it's a bad term. It's so overused, and people get empathy and sympathy all mixed up and all
Yeah,
kinds of things. And
thank you.
Bowen would talk about the ability of the clinician to be emotionally objective and emotionally neutral. And those two things, when a clinician or a helper can be in that position, the other side of the interaction seems to find that very helpful.
Can you say a little more about that piece you just said about the problem they have to solve together?
Yeah,
What do you mean by that, Dan Papero?
well, I as a clinician, or I as a person who's worked with Bowen theory, can get quite convinced I have great knowledge. And the minute I do that, I'm in big trouble. And so, in a certain sense, that person or that family or that business or whatever it is, and I are embarking on an experiment together. We're going to try to figure out where objective reality lies between us. And then if we can see that objective reality with some clarity, we can begin to carefully define whatever the problems are that could be worked on if one wanted to work on them. And from that position, then one moves more into the role of, if one's the helper, one moves more into the role of that position of coach who's sort of, in a certain sense, helping structure and supervise the effort, but not having the responsibility for the effort. Something like that.
Dan, I'm glad we got that one there on YouTube.
Well, for what it's worth.
And I want to ask you something. So I've observed forever that my Bowen mentors, everyone I've known, does that in an impressive way. And then there comes a moment where they throw in a whole bunch of advice, and it's often extremely helpful. Now, there's probably times when it isn't. But what do you think about that? Does advice then come in upon that platform at times?
Sure it does. There's a lot of variation among people using Bowen theory in some sort of helping role about that. I have tried over the years to do as little of that as possible. Now, I'm an oldest brother, and boy, I got advice out my ears. I can rip it out in a heartbeat. And I've done that on what I believe has to do with my understanding of differentiation of self, which has to do with the individual assuming the responsibility or the thinking process about the issues of his or her life. And that if that individual will do that, he or she will begin to find a pathway through whatever the obstacles are. Now, it's one thing to give advice. It's another thing to put ideas into the mix. Advice, and again, we get into what do the words mean, and people understand different things by the words. But advice often takes the form of, I think you should. A suggestion is more along the lines of, well, research has suggested that many people find this helpful. Something like that.
Yeah.
It's
maybe,
advice.
Maybe
advice
like,
tends to. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Erik.
Maybe it could be like, I wonder if it would be useful for you to consider.
Something like that. Yeah. Advice. And again, we're talking here, the words has more to do with the process about how that's delivered. Advice often comes with an emotional boom to it. You should do this, something like that. Ed Friedman was a genius at that. The problem with that is that if it isn't done really well, it automatically raises the back of the other one. But it also, if it isn't done very well, the other one grabs that and says, this is what I should do. They go out and do it. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't, they come back and say, I did what you said I should do, which is usually an imperfect understanding of what was said to begin with.
And
And then,
you may have borrowed a bit of self from them in the
yeah,
process.
right, something like that.
I haven't heard you. I have not heard you talk much about Friedman just for a minute since you mentioned. What did you mean by that? That he was a genius at that?
Ed could put a lot of shoulds into things, at least in my engagements with Ed and watching him. Now, there are people who knew Ed much better than I ever knew him, so let me be clear about that. He had very clear
Genius
ideas.
sounded like a compliment, was it?
It was meant to be more descriptive. It's not what I think is most useful thing for people. I would differ with Ed on that. But you know, I haven't gotten the Nobel Prize for wisdom here, and my helping skills. So who am I to criticize Ed? He's probably the best known helper with Bowen theory that ever existed. His version of Bowen theory.
Dan, if we had the ability to bring the ghost of Dr. Murray Bowen down into this call right now, and you had the chance to push on him like you wished you had back when you had an afro. And by the way, I never knew you had an afro. And Dan, I would love to see that photograph.
My children have photos. It's
How high
real.
was it? How many inches high was it, Dan?
It was long.
What would you push on him about if you could have that moment back?
Oh, I'd push on him a lot harder about differentiation of self, trying to pin down what he's talking about, what he's working on. That remains such a difficult thing for people today to do. We're still wrestling with how do you measure differentiation of self. I'd probably push on him more around I'd push on him more about this whole concept of triangling, which I think is extremely difficult for people to understand and grab onto. It remains, in some ways, for me, one of the most challenging aspects of Bowen's thinking, because he's really talking about a structure that lies beneath the relationship network. And that structure is pulsing, if you will. It's pulsing in a way which is designed, if Bowen is correct, to maintain a certain level of stability within that system. Stability being defined as predictability of relationships and predictability of the use of metabolic energy within that system. It's a piece we don't talk about much anymore either. That family systems are utilizing metabolic and psychological energy that has a shelf life to it. It isn't infinite. And that when the system slips into some sort of imbalance, and I don't like the word imbalance, but I don't have a better one, some sort of disturbance of its routine, energy is directed to maintenance functions. And as energy is directed to maintenance functions, it's removed from task functions. And at a certain point, if the disturbance and if the mechanisms to compensate for that disturbance become embedded or chronic, then one has a chronic situation where the energy available to the system is being spent increasingly on maintenance and less on task, which results in an incompetent level of functioning on the individual level and an incompetent level of functioning on the level of the relationship system itself as it pursues its functions. Organizationally, of course, you can define quite clearly what the functions of an organization are. What is it it's trying to do, and what are the steps to that? The human family, you have to really wrestle with the question, well, what does functioning mean for a human family system? The mental health world has thrown that world dysfunctional out there without any definition of what functioning is. And my own way of grappling with that has been to move back to evolutionary biology and think about and to follow Tinbergen's 4 questions that he proposed in the late 1960s to guide what at that point was called ethological research, the study of behavior and context. Nowadays, it's much more typically referred to as ecological research. And his question number one has to do with what function is served by an evolutionary development? In other words, what function was served with the evolution of this particular phenomenon, this particular phenotype, or whatever it is?
Mm.
And if the human family is a biological unit, and I believe it is a product of evolution, then what functions did it evolve to serve? And those functions are connected to what are called somatic and reproductive interests. Somatic interests have to do with the collection of resources to support life itself. And reproductive interests have to do with the use of those resources to create the conditions under which the individual reproduces and sends genetic material on into the future. Now, for the human family, both of those are enormous.
Launching a child.
Yeah. The reproductive cost to the human family is enormous. If you think about human infants have this extraordinary...
I'm very well aware of that cost.
You got college kids. Yeah, right. You got this long developmental period. In any event, so you can derive 4 functions for the human family out of, at least I did. There are 2 primary ones. One is an economic function, that is to gather and derive resources from the environment to support life and support the reproductive function. And the second is to create the conditions for reproduction, to create the relationship structure in which the child develops. There are 2 subsidiary or derivative functions from that. One is a maintenance function, that is to maintain the relationship structures itself that support the economic and reproductive functions. And the fourth one is a defensive function, to respond when threat is perceived and those functions are threatened. So anyway, you can go on from there, and there's a long-winded
Well, what I heard you say is that the triangle is very complicated. You're more interested in how it functions than fixing it.
Than fixing it.
That it probably does a lot well, but that it can become a part of a cycle that impedes success on those dimensions that you were just sharing with us.
Well, it has a number of functions. The triangle has a control function for one thing, which Laurie Lassiter pointed out years ago, but it also has other functions as well. And the one that's most, I think, overlooked is this balancing function. If you think about the human propensity, Bowen talks about each individual in the family seeking an optimum level of closeness distance to every other. And that there are constant micro adjustments going on within the family relationships as each individual seeks to hit a rough approximation of that zone of optimum comfort. And that shifting within a triangle of among 3 can work very well as long as pressure doesn't come on it, upping what Bowen called the togetherness force. I've been calling it the potentiality for togetherness, because I think force conveys something other than what one really sees. In any event, and that can be contained within that. Bowen talks about the ability of the triangle to absorb more stress, more discomfort, if you will, than the 2-person system can do alone. Because it allows more flexibility in this closeness distance adjustment all the time. So there's this, and when it's in the zone where all 3 are more or less most of the time hitting that optimal closeness distance balance, you can call that triangle stable. But when it's knocked out of stability, it starts this phenomenon Bowen referred to as interlocking, which it's descriptive. I'm not sure what to do with it exactly. I find it confusing a lot of the time. But he's really talking about mechanisms that spin out, which allow more relationships to come into play, which make it easier for any individual within it to hit this optimum closeness distance balance somewhere in the mix. Anyway, it's a lot could be said about that.
And you've already given us so much to chew on, and just to orient, in probably about 5 minutes, we'll allow people on the call to try to integrate some of what Dr. Papero has been sharing with us in a 10-minute breakout room. And one of you be lucky enough to to land with Dr. Papero himself, and you can share
Woohoo.
some thoughts. Big prize. That's the prize, Dan.
All right, woohoo.
Ring. That's the gold ring. So I wanted to ask you this one. Have you observed any inspiring stories of family leadership lately?
You have to define what you mean by inspiring, Eric. There are so many.
Something
I
that
I just did a
that
clinical.
struck you as the real deal?
Yeah.
Something that struck you as actually an example of a person using these ideas to make things substantially better?
Family leadership is such an interesting little devil to grab on. What is it? Is the person who follows more of a leader than the one who takes the first step? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's true.
Mhm.
So who is leading in the family? Bowen, has that nice little paragraph that he wrote at the very end of his life on family leadership, where he leaves in bullet points about 5 points about the family leader. I did a clinical conference a month ago for the symposium, and I interviewed two women who, I don't know if you would call it inspired family leadership, but I would call it, these women have become leaders in their family, and it makes a difference in how the family is responding to the conditions it faces, which is what I would consider leadership. And each of them takes these principles, some of the principles of Bowen theory, but each of them applies them differently. And I think that's one of the things that one has to keep in mind. It's much like what Eleanor Ostrom says about the core design principles for the management of a common resource property. All successful common resource property managements have most of these principles embodied in them, but each group that's done it does it differently, something like that. So that family leadership has within it certain core components, but they're not performed the same way in all families. But I think it's all there. The pieces are all there in some way, shape, or form. So in a certain sense, you know it when you see it, but it's hard to describe it as an abstraction.
Can you give us a little flavor? And some may have the opportunity to go and watch those interviews. They're probably recorded and available from the Bowen Center. Give us a little flavor of some move that strikes you as a good example of what you just shared with us.
Well, this would involve a late 40s woman who is the youngest in her family, who has herself struggled over the years with heavy physical symptoms connected to deep emotional reactivity. And so she's the youngest. She's got this set of challenges she's dealing with. You wouldn't necessarily expect her to be the leader of the family. And in some ways, what she's taken a hold of is the idea of differentiation of self, using her thinking side to manage her problematic side. And she starts out by figuring out how to function in spite of the symptomatology. So just how to get up in the morning, go to work, that sort of thing. Then she begins an effort to work on the degree of emotional distance between herself and her siblings. And she is also most connected to her own mother. So she begins to work on crossing, in the jargon of Bowen theory, bridging the cutoffs, if you will. At the same time, she's working on defining herself to her mother. And again, in the jargon of Bowen theory, she's working at being able to get a person-to-person relationship with her mother, woman to woman, as opposed to child to mother. It's a different way to say it.
Yeah.
This defining self gets to be such a jargon. What the hell does that mean?
I always like the simple definition. I know what you think, and you know what I think.
Something like that.
That sure ain't easy to pull off at times in such relationships.
And as she's done this, what has happened has been that other members of the family, her mother is now in her 80s and beginning to face her own decline. And so there are the usual things that crop up as that happens, the medical emergencies and the sorts of things. And what's been fascinating for this woman to watch, and it wasn't that she intended this, but as she's gone this way, her siblings have become more involved. The resources of the broader family system are available to her. So the family is responding differently to a set of conditions faced. Now, what's interesting about this is that a very similar set of conditions happened, or a very similar set of circumstances happened 20 years ago at the point this woman's father was declining, and this did not happen. So you've got a then and now comparison, which suggests to you that you have something different going on here.
I think it's so hard to prove, do these things make these outcomes, but you can see these stories where there's a real strong case for it.
Yeah.
And one of the great places where Bowen offers really unique solutions are these puzzles about adult siblings. And we have an amazing example of that will be presented at our conference on polarization leadership that's coming up. If you don't mind, I would like to take a moment now just to tell folks on the call what's coming up here in this series we're doing and the other things we're offering. There's all kinds of really wonderful opportunities across the Bowen Theory Network. Most of you on this call probably know it. I think the opportunities are expanding because of the COVID disruption, and everything's online now. And that's a really rich opportunity for people. So here's what we're going to be doing soon. I just mentioned this conference, Polarization Leadership. Matthew Dickinson, Dr. Dickinson is somebody who's got a Ph.D. in political science from Harvard and studied with one of the most preeminent presidential scholars in the country in the 20th century. And he's got a lot to say about polarization. And I'm really looking forward. He knows nothing about Bowen theory, but he's interested. I'm going to be talking about Jonathan Haidt's work. And Kim Ziegelman, one of our new faculty, is going to be talking about something very similar to what Dan just talked about, how you could use Bowen theory to overcome adult sibling challenges. It's a wonderful story. We've also got, coming up in early January, I'm going to interview a very thoughtful family business leader on a very interesting story of using Bowen theory to help make succession work out. And soon after that, Leslie Fox and I will be with Mark Roberts, a very interesting meditation teacher from my perspective, continuing to explore this connection between inner silence and differentiation, which, as many of you know, is one of my primary interests. We're doing a course called Moonlight Swim, which will be a dive into transcendental meditation, different than talking about it, but actually experiencing it together. And this YouTube videos of our 2-day conference on that topic from this fall. Many of you that we have this meeting will be recorded, easy to find on the Vermont Center for Family Studies YouTube channel, where all these events will be. And then coming up March, really delighted to have a really great thinker, Dr. Walter Smith, come talk to us about going beyond a disease model of social impact. So with that, what I would like to do now is give you all a chance to try to integrate some of what Dan's been talking about using the breakout room functionality in Zoom, which I'm setting up now. You are allowed to leave you have the ability to leave your Zoom room if you want. If you want to just get out of this, you can, or you could leave the meeting and come back in 10 minutes. That'd be fine, obviously. But this functionality will move you into groups of 3. And here's some suggested way to think about what to do at that time. Some very simple questions for you to consider. And I like to suggest that don't worry about introductions. You're only going to have 10 minutes. It's going to fly by. If somebody could just take the ball and start off and say, well, here's what I'm thinking about, talk for a few minutes. And I suggest you avoid trying to see if you all can agree. It's not really about meeting people. It's about an opportunity for you to integrate your thinking. That's what this breakout's about. All right, so the Zoom functionality will move you into those breakout rooms that most of you probably know that Dr. Papero wrote a really good book called Bowen Family Systems Theory. I want to make sure that people still know this book exists. I think it probably can be found used on Amazon. It's an interesting addition to the literature on Bowen theory. It's concise and it's got its own unique voice. And I recommend it. I think it's an amazing book.
If you can find it, you know, it tends to be out of print and then it gets these astronomical prices on it. Anyway.
Yeah, but there's also other things Dan has written. This book here, Theory and Practice, that the Bowen Center published, contains a number of articles that Dr. Papero has written, and he has a new bunch of new publications, including one he did with Bob Noon on research that's pertaining to Bowen theory. And just before we allow you to get into the conversation here and ask Dr. Papero some questions you might have, I just want to mention how much we appreciate the contributions that we've been receiving that allow us to continue doing this. It isn't free to do this. I operate mostly as a volunteer, but we have some paid staff that make it possible for me to do this and cover our costs. And it's just very encouraging, no matter how small the amount. When people support us, it's easy to do by hitting the donate page on our website. And this is this little diagram here shows you exactly what our mission is and what our the money you donate to us will go towards doing in the world, strengthening families, which are the foundational units in society. And also that we have this professional training program. Many of you know that. I'm really pleased, Dan, with this training program. Dr. Bunning always liked the idea of having one, but during her professional time, it didn't happen. But Michael Gilman, Nancy Weber, and I, Monica Beige, before she passed away, took the ball and we got it going. And it's wonderful to have seen new faculty emerge from that program who are now teaching in it. So Dan, we've come a ways in Vermont and you helped us get there.
Well, Eric, it looked like one of the real struggling points was when Dr. Beige died, and watching the center stagger under that kind of the loss of a major figure within that particular center. And somehow you and the folks in Vermont found a way through that. And that's impressive. A lot of things go under those conditions. Then the Vermont Center for Family Studies didn't. So good on you.
Yeah, Dr. Beige, I miss her because boy, would she have been contributing.
She was a major one.
So we have a few more minutes with Dr. Papero, and I'm going to put myself on gallery view and try to keep my eyes out. If you raise your hand up and keep it up a little bit, but maybe to start with, if just one of you could just jump in, just unmute yourself and ask a question. You are very welcome to do that now, or make a comment. What are you thinking about? What was interesting in your small group? You could type the question into chat too, if you prefer, and then I'll read it out.
Stephanie is raising her hand.
Stephanie, go ahead.
I'm very interested in Dr. Papero's thinking about the 4 levels, 4 dimensions of functioning in the family. I find it very, very helpful to see how you look at how the family as a unit is organized around certain functions. To me, the functions have to do with the biological imperatives They're that fundamental, the imperative to survive and the imperative to reproduce. That these are, the family is the unit among all different other ways that humans organize. It's the family alone is the unit of reproduction. And that makes it also an economic unit.
Right.
And the way that these 4 levels of functioning, very interested. I'd like to ask Dr. Papero where he's written more about that. Where can we study that more?
You know, it's a good question, Stephanie. I think I did a little bit of it in the article I wrote on toward a model of family assessment that got published 2-3 years ago. I think there's a little bit of it there. I've talked about it more at conferences than I've written about it. I've done more extrapolation of the idea in conferences I've done than talking about it.
Dan, what do you think might be one of the best recordings that's out there of one of those lectures?
Oh gosh, Erik, I don't know. I do so many. I don't know.
Who records them and who sells the recordings?
Well, the Bowen Center records them. I don't know if they sell all of those.
That might be a good place to go look.
Chicago, Stephanie's group doesn't record them anymore. Because, you know, you get all these recordings and what do you do with them? I don't know. There've been a lot of, I've had the wonderful opportunity over the years to be on panels where I've had to interact with many, many scientists, many, many biologists. And about 10 years ago at a meeting in Vancouver, I and the biological anthropologist Mark Flynn were the featured speakers. And I had just done a talk on family emotional process and what I thought the factors were that went into it, what led to its repetition, and how it occurred within contexts and how that was carried forward. And I don't know if you've ever run up against Mark Flynn, Erik. I bet you might have somewhere along the way, but that is one intense guy. And he starts pushing on me about how do you link that into evolution? How do you link that into evolution? If you can do that, it's really important. And so I started working on that. And you know, that's where it came out. I was influenced by the biologist Richard Alexander, who in fact was Mark Flynn's teacher. Although I didn't know that at the point I discovered Richard Alexander's work. The one I discovered first was his work on the biology of moral systems, which is a fascinating, difficult work to read, but where he picks up this.
Mark Flynn's amazing research on that island, going down there and taking saliva samples from people for 30 years.
Yep.
And some of the brilliant things he's come out with, including the power of grandparents. I've quoted that one to people many times. And the way I summarize it is grandma defeats trauma. And he's got the biological details to prove it. So Dan, someone asked the question, how do you become a better observer?
You work at it. You work at, first of all, observing yourself. You have to turn on your cognitive system in order to observe. You have to begin to regulate what you're paying attention to. Often it's useful when people will track something. Do people know what their physiology does when they experience more of a stress reaction? Are they aware of it as opposed to it just happening? A more sophisticated version of that has to do with people's ability to track what's going on in their heads based upon the level of tension they feel that they can identify in themselves. Another kind of tracking has to do with taking on a relationship that one is interested in and trying to track the emotional interchange between people, not what the content is, that's the tennis ball, but the tennis stroke that's hitting the ball back and forth, how each is putting a spin on it. And people can work at observing that and tracking that. You know, there are lots of ways to observe. Meditation is a good way to observe. And in meditation, one of the principal processes has to do with, at least as I have listened to people, I'm not a good meditator myself, and I don't know a whole lot about it, but people are actually gaining control of their focal attention.
Yeah,
And
focus.
that's what it's all about. All cognitive ability begins with that gaining of focal attention. That has to do, it's the first developmental marker, I believe, that's observable in an infant of self-regulation. And that is at about age 9 months, somewhere in that range, an infant will begin to direct its gaze away from something that is disturbing to it. It will look away. That is, the infant is taking charge of the focal attention and directing it somewhere else. Now that rests upon the development of neural circuitry that permits that, which probably begins to emerge in month 4 or 5, where the so-called default mode circuit of the individual begins to develop, which is what happens when the individual is essentially at rest. The default mode circuit kicks in. With the default mode circuit kicking in, the emergence of the second circuitry, which is the so-called salient circuitry, emerges, which then begins to produce the ability to shift brain functioning into 2 different circuits, so that one can shift out of the default into the salience, which is picking up that which is relevant in the environment, which then allows the control of the response to that, something like that. For an infant at age 4 months, that's just in the earliest phases of even these two systems emerging. But by 9 months, you can see it in behavior. And of course, emotion regulation goes on from there across development, if it happens. And all of us get some of it. None of us get as good at it as we probably could be.
Dan, what have you learned from being a grandparent?
I have learned, oh, geez, there's a book that could be written about that. Being a grandparent has been one of the most important things. I benefited greatly from my grandparents. I believe that my grandparents, particularly my maternal grandmother, was extremely important to my survival at a very important point in life when my own nuclear family fell into some pretty hard times in a certain sense. And it was her ability somehow to maintain contact with me that was extremely important. And I have learned, I guess what I've learned about being a grandparent is that those damn kids are important to me too. And if they're important to me, I better figure out how to manage myself with them and not just be a ooey gooey grandparent, but to be into how do I engage and appreciate what these kids are up against, and how do I think alongside them to the degree that they'll let me, to the degree that they're interested in that, about what's going on, and to be available to them whenever that's necessary. And sometimes that's not very convenient. Any of you know who are a parent of a teenager, the teenager doesn't come to talk to you at a time that's convenient to you. In fact, a teenager worth his salt will pick the time when you're at your worst. When you're tired, you're hungry, you're hungover, that's when your kid wants to talk to you.
I'm getting a lot of value out of the question, when would you like to go out to dinner?
Yeah, there's that one too. Yeah.
There's a question, someone has a hand up here, perhaps related to grandparenting. Connie,
Hi. Oops.
or a comment? You're muted. No, you're unmuted.
There.
Okay. Go ahead. What
Um,
are you thinking about?
Picking up on that a little bit, considering the context that we've been in with this isolation and so forth in our culture, and how it's affecting children. And, sometimes we don't realize it because they don't have the words to tell us. But we know now that there's a lot of mental distress with children, young children, as well as teenagers. And wondering what kind of processes could be helpful for parents and other caring adults to mitigate this kind of situation of mental distress for children, which has long-term implications.
And let me just,
Well,
Dan, I like to let people go on time. We just have 1 minute. So if you could
oh boy.
give us a few thoughts.
I would just say for parents, if you really want to be helpful to your kids, get your own emotional reactivity under control, get your own distress under control, and then be available to your kids. And quit focusing on the kids' distress. The kids are going to make it through this, most of them. They're young. Kids have always made it through it, most of them. If we lose some along the way, that's always been true.
Dan, I'm seeing a lot of resilience out there. A lot
Okay,
of
yep,
resilience
time
in
to, yep.
kids. And I just want to mention that last week we did a multi-generational family Zoom leadership episode with John Kamak, and I thought it was really an extraordinary conversation. I was really pleased with how it went. So that's available on our YouTube if you're interested in these Zoom calls that happen. There's a lot of really good information about how Bowen theory can contribute to that. And hope you have a good holiday, Hanukkah, happy Hanukkah, and maybe see you in January when I'll be talking to this family business leader, very thoughtful man, Ernie Pomelo. And if you have any questions about the Moonlight Swim course, Transcendental Meditation course and that we'll be doing, or questions about the upcoming conferences on polarization, just go ahead and let me know. I'd be happy to interact with you and talk to you about those things. Enjoy the ride, folks.
Hey, Dan, great to see you.
Hey, Nancy. Bye, everybody.
Long
Same
time.
here, Dan.
Hey, Mark.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you, Dan.
Yep.
Thanks,
All right,
Suzanne.
thanks,
Good to
Dan.
see You.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Dan.